one of the things that we try to do each year is to sponsor what I've called a couple of luncheon events where people could come for an hour and engage in something interesting, important, particularly on the areas of race and slavery in America. Today we're going to see what I think is going to be a very interesting reenactment of a key civil rights moment involving a lady named Fannie Lou Hamer. Before we get to that, I'd just like to make a couple of introductory comments. We are in the midst of a spate of civil rights anniversaries from 2011 through 2015, a lot of 50th anniversaries of key events in that important time in American history. We've seen attention paid in 2011 to the Freedom Riders, and in 2013 to the March on Washington, for example, and this year to the anniversary of the Civil Rights Act and other events, Freedom Summer, for example. And you know, those events can do a lot of different things. One of them is to make us feel good and nostalgic and look back with, as I sometimes lapse into, to look back with fondness for an earlier time when people were engaged in trying to right wrongs. And as we look around on the news and all the images we've seen just this week, we see people trying to engage in that. Certainly commemoration and nostalgia and sentimentalism is not enough. And I'd like to start us with a quotation from a publication called The American Historian, which appeared this week in my mailbox. It's a publication of the Organization of American Historians. And a faculty member at Oberlin named Renee Romano writes a key piece in here called Beyond Self-Congratulatory Celebration, Complicating Civil Rights Anniversaries. And let me just, after she goes through all the things that are happening to commemorate and all the nostalgia that's being stirred up, she says this: most powerfully, veterans of the civil rights movement have used the same anniversary moments to criticize the nostalgic, sentimental view of the movement prevalent in much of our popular culture and political discourse, and to generate new energy to continue the struggle for justice today. At the 50th anniversary commemoration of the March on Washington last August, this was obviously written and published, took a while to get into the publication process. Martin Luther King III insisted that it was not the time for nostalgic commemoration or self-congratulatory celebration. The work of his father was not yet done, he insisted. Former Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activist John Lewis focused on the need for new voting rights protections, while Jesse Jackson called for a revival of the war on poverty. Members of the audience carried placards with pictures of Trayvon Martin, the 17-year-old African-American shot and killed by George Zimmerman in 2012, and chanted slogans that called for an end to the widespread incarceration of black men. In June, movement veterans organized the Freedom Summer 1964 50th Anniversary Conference hosted by the University of Southern Mississippi, which aimed not only to recognize those who had worked in Mississippi in 1964, but also to brainstorm how to further the struggle for full equality there. Veterans of the movement have sought to use the attention being paid to civil rights anniversaries to nurture a new generation of activists who will continue the fight against poverty and racism. And so one of the reasons that we're here today is not just simply, hopefully, to see what I think is going to be an interesting presentation, but to be prompted, to be motivated, to think about and act on some of the issues that still confront us in society having to do with race today. With that, I would like to introduce the star of our event. Dr. Lyn Lewis is a longtime professor of sociology and Black Studies, later African American Studies, here at UDM. Lyn's career spanned a whole lot of changes in the university, including its name. And Lyn was heavily involved in two manifestations of that program today we call African American Studies, helping with myself and Stephanie Mitchum to bring it back in 1998-99 after an earlier manifestation in the 70s and early 80s called Black Studies. Lyn, I think, influenced thousands of students very much for the better. Lyn certainly played a major role in making changes in her department, fighting hard, sometimes to keep it alive, and also important work in the college and the university. And I can tell you firsthand, having been on committees with Lyn, that some of my favorite memories of committee work here at the university were Lyn Lewis moments when she, in her own way, spoke truth to power, including one with a former provost. With that, I'd like to introduce Lyn, and Lyn is going to first, I think, tell a little bit about the moment she's going to reenact, and then she is going to be Fannie Lou Hamer and take us back to 1964 in Atlantic City, the Democratic National Convention, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, and she is going to channel Fannie Lou Hamer and speak truth to power. Lyn, why don't you come on?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Finkenbine, for all your kind words. Very kind words. Yes, I've had some good moments here at the University of Detroit and the University of Detroit Mercy. And I'm honored and privileged to return, especially to return to reenact a very special moment that was a part of a movement by a very courageous lady, a very strong and determined lady, a fearless lady, a lady to whom all of us can admire and respect, irrespective of our different backgrounds or our different experiences. That lady is none other than Mrs. Fanny Lou Hamer. At this point, I will do my best to become her. Mr. Chairman, the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fanny Lou Hamer. I live at 626 East Lafayette Street in Ruleville, Mississippi, in the Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastman and Senator Stennis. It was the 31st of August in 1962. 18 of us traveled 26 miles so that we could register to vote. We was met by the state patrolman and the police in Indianola because they didn't want us to register to vote. But we was gonna register to vote because we wanted to become first-class citizens. And they only allowed 2 of us
at a time to take the literacy test. Only 2 of us. But we stayed there until all of us had gone in and taken that literacy test. Then we got back on the bus and headed back to Louisville. But on the way, the state patrolman stopped us and arrested the bus driver. Told the bus driver that the charges were driving the wrong color. They didn't arrest him for reckless driving. They didn't arrest him for driving the wrong way on a one-way street. They didn't arrest him for speeding. They arrested him for driving the wrong color, because we was Negroes and we were brown and that was the wrong color. Well, we got together and we paid the fine and we went on back to Louisville. And Reverend Sonny carried me when we got to the rural area. He carried me for 4 miles back to the plantation where I had been a timekeeper and a sharecropper for 18 years. 18 long, hard years. I saw my children, and they met me, and they told me the plantation owner was mad with me. The plantation owner had found out that I had gone to Nola with some other people, and that I had registered to vote. And so then the plantation owner came toward me, and he said, "Fanny Lou, did you go there in the Nola and register to vote?" And I told him, "Yes, sir, I did." And he said, "Well, you're going to have to go back and withdraw your registration, because you ain't staying here on my plantation if you registered to vote. We ain't ready for that kind of thing in Mississippi. And even if you withdraw, you're going to have to leave my plantation." I told him, "I didn't register to vote for you. I registered to vote for me. I registered to vote so that I could become a first-class citizen." And I left. I left that night. And on the 10th of September, in 1962, they fired all these bullets in Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tucker's house. See, they were looking for me. The bullets were meant for me. They knew I went on the plantation home. So they were going to find me, and they were going to kill me. And then, that same night, 2 little girls were shot in Louisville. And then they blew up Mr. McDonald's house. And then on June 9th, 1963, I had attended a voter registration workshop. And we were returning back to Mississippi. And we were on the Continental Trailway bus. And the police and the state highway patrolman stopped us. And they say, "Where y'all been?" And we told them we'd been to a voter registration workshop. And they arrested the people who had gotten off the bus to use the washroom. They didn't let them use the washroom. the police and the state highway patrolman ordered them out. And they put them in the police car. And they saw that I was still on the bus. And the police officer said, "Get that one there too." And they came and they got me off the bus. And so they started trying to talk to me, asking me questions. And I told them, yeah, we've been registered to vote. And we've been to a voter registration workshop. And they put us in a booking room. And then they started taking us to cells, putting us in our own cells. And when they took me to my cell, I started hearing these loud licks. And I started hearing these loud screams. And they got louder. Horrible screams. And then I heard this white man say, "Can't you say so, nigga? Can't you say so?" And then I heard these loud screams again. And horrible screams. And I heard the woman say, "Yeah, I can say so, but I ain't gonna say it to you. I don't know you enough to say so to you." And then the policeman came into my cell. And he came into my cell with 2 Negro prisoners. And he gave one of them a blackjack. And he told him, "Beat her with that blackjack. Beat her." And he beat me. And he beat me. And he beat me so he was exhausted. He couldn't even beat me no more. And when he couldn't beat me no more, the policeman gave the blackjack to the other Negro prisoner. And then he started beating me. And when I was 6 years old, I had polio. And it beat me so bad, I thought I had polio again. And I started wiggling my foot to try not to feel some of the pain. And then the policeman held my foot down so I couldn't wiggle it. And then as he was beating me, my dress started to come up. And I was trying to put my dress down. And he raised my dress back up. And I tried to put my dress back down. And he kept beating me. And I thought about the other woman who was being beaten. Because when she was being beaten, she started praying for the man who was beating her. Now he beating her. She didn't pray for herself. She prayed and asked the Lord to have mercy on the man who was beating her. And I thought about that. And they went on and they just beat me. And I started screaming. And it seemed like they weren't going to put me. And then finally the white man said, "Shut up! Shut up!" And I tried to shut up. Then I thought about what all I was going through. Only because I wanted to be a first-class citizen. I wanted to have my right to vote. And I thought about my ancestors. I thought about how in 1865, Emancipation Proclamation, and they had been told that they were free, and they really weren't free, I thought about them. And then I thought about how they must have felt after that when the Civil Rights Act was passed of 1866. And it was supposed to give them full and equal benefits of all laws that were enjoyed by white folk. And I thought about how they didn't get it. And then I thought about how much they were lynched and mutilated. And I thought about how they'd kill them again after they had killed them. And so they came up with the anti-peonage act. And in the anti-peonage act in 1867, see, you couldn't reduce nobody to a peon level. Because what was going on at that time was the former owners of plantations, the slave masters, they wanted to keep the slaves. So they were keeping the slaves and making them live like peons. But that wasn't being enforced, because after that they passed the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment, it was supposed to give my ancestors equal protection of the law. But then they had already passed the anti-peonage act. And before that, they had passed the Civil Rights Act. And before that, they had passed the Emancipation Proclamation. And they still weren't free. And then they passed the 15th Amendment in 1870 that was supposed to give my folk the right to vote. That was in 1870. And here I am in 1963. I'm still fighting for that right. And then, after that, they passed the Enforcement Act that same year to enforce the 15th Amendment that was supposed to give people the right to vote. But it wasn't being enforced because they came back the next year and passed the Force Act to enforce the Enforcement Act of 1870 that was supposed to enforce the 15th Amendment. But that didn't work, so then they came up with the Ku Klux Act, better known as K-Law. And the Ku Klux Act was supposed to stop all the lynching and all the violence when people were trying to go and vote. And it was supposed to enforce the Force Act that was supposed to enforce the Enforcement Act that was supposed to enforce the 15th Amendment and give people the right to vote. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I'm sick and tired of being treated like I'm not a first-class citizen. Treated like this all on account that I want my right to vote. And I want to be a first-class citizen like white folk. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I ask you, what kind of America is this? I question this America. This America we call the land of the free and the home of the braves. I question this America. If this the America that you want me to live in, then you tell me, what you gonna do with me? What you gonna do with Mrs. Fanny Lou Hamer in your America? Thank you.
just to set the context, and then I thought we could have some discussion,
Sure.
Q&A.
Sure.
May I say, wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Lewis, and I got chills. You know. Just to say a few words to set the context, particularly for 1964, August of 1964. First thing I want to say is you got to see something that the country didn't get to see, which is Fannie Lou Hamer's entire speech. She was actually speaking on live television in August of 1964 during the Democratic National Convention credentials hearings, and they were carried on live television. And I have to alert the younger people in the room, this is a time when there were only 3 networks, and also a time when political conventions actually mattered. They actually fought about real things and were contested. Okay, Doctor, thank you. So the country didn't get to see the whole thing, and I'll explain that in a moment. The plug literally was pulled on her speech because it was too hot to handle for certain people. And as Dr. Finkenbine said, you know, when I think of her speaking truth to power, I think of a lot of people from the 60s who did that. Fanny Lou Hamer's in the Hall of Fame, the Mount Rushmore in American history, and certainly in the Civil Rights Movement. You go to the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, and her name's on it. You can touch it through the water, and it's a very crowded spot. This is a woman, she grew up in the sharecropping Delta region of Mississippi, the Magnolia State, which she was the youngest of 20, which was not unusual for people living in the country. She was in the fields working at age 6, and she had to quit school, formal schooling at age 12, in order to support and help her family. So she did not have a lot of formal education. She had other qualities that allowed her to transcend that. But, you know, Mississippi, even in the 1960s, was the most segregated, racially segregated state in the Union. And I would also argue, you agree with me, the poorest? Maybe it still is, I don't know. This is 50 years ago. So the conditions were bad in Mississippi, for racially and in terms of education. There's a famous quote from Dr. King in one of his speeches. I didn't get the exact numbers, maybe you know this. He stood back and he said, Mississippi, I think it's 1965, the state of Mississippi is now registering 300 blacks a month. And at that rate, 1/2 of the eligible blacks in Mississippi will be registered in 700 years. And tells you something about the pace of change that was happening. She's somebody who helped push that forward, push it forward. She went to a voter registration workshop in 1962, and she called it life-changing. She realized she had power, she wanted to be with these people who were on the right side of history, and she was willing to put her body on the line to do those things. This was a dangerous thing to do in the Delta of Mississippi in 1962, 63, and so forth. I have here, Fanny Lou Hamer, as you can tell, she was fired for her activities. She fired from the plantation where she worked for 20 years. She was basically exiled from there. Yes, they have plantations. She was threatened, beaten, and shot at. And she's got her credentials as a warrior on the Civil Rights Movement. She was an organizer of what they call the Mississippi Freedom Summer, in which hundreds of college students from the North went into the South, even into the backwaters of the South, to push for voter registration for African Americans. And you probably know that's where 3 civil rights workers were killed, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. And so she was right in the heart of all of that kind of thing. Comes around to August of 1964, and Fannie Lou Hamer goes to the Democratic National Convention, and she's pushing an alternate slate of delegates to the all-white, Mississippi at that time, 42% black. They had an all-white segregationist slate of delegates at the nominating convention in 1964. A lot of talk about freedom. a big lag as far as institutions, as far as government moving forward, as far as the two political parties, a big lag. She spoke on behalf of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an alternate slate that would be integrated, that would represent actual citizens of Mississippi. Mr. Schwerner's widow was one of the delegates who was on this alternate slate, and she got her chance to speak. And this was probably her most famous moment. The 60s, and I grew up watching it on TV, has a lot of indelible TV moments, and she had a moment. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lots of contradictions, very mixed record in history. You know, he actually really was the civil rights president. He took a lot of risks. He spent a lot of political capital. He dedicated himself, no matter what it took, to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which started the desegregation process in this country, as far as legal segregation. And a year later, he would be the president who would push, against the advice of many politicians, many advisors, he pushed for a Voting Rights Act in 1965, and he had the legislative skills to get those things passed. So you could almost say no LBJ, no Obama, as far as voting rights. He's the politician that did shake up the system. He's the civil rights president. You could also say no Fannie Lou Hamer, no President Obama. Atlantic City, New Jersey, it's a coronation. LBJ had a rather large ego. And I would call, he wasn't there to really debate things, to fight about things. He was a control freak. And he thought about African Americans, well, I'm helping them. They shouldn't be rocking the boat. They shouldn't be, just let me control this. This was LBJ's way. Again, only 3 networks, and when the conventions meant something. She called for this, she had a chance to speak. And as you saw, it was carried on national television. And people actually watched conventions back in those days also. And as Dr. Lewis said, I mean, she struck the country with her eloquence, her dignity, her determination. And I like that word, fearlessness. I mean, that just comes across so well. There's an extraordinary TV moment. I picture, she's talking about, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and these great words, and she's speaking from the heart. And her eloquence would put to shame 5 Harvard PhDs. You know, she really conveyed the message in a very personal way. And it was captivating television. LBJ famously had 3 TV sets in the Oval Office, and he used to watch and switch the channels. I think he had the first clicker. And he would, how are they covering me? What are they saying about me? What about Vietnam? He got a load of what she was doing, and it's still mind-boggling to this day. He decided to call an impromptu presidential news conference right in the middle of the speech for no other reason than to silence this voice and to get it off the air because it was disruptive. He actually took it all personally. How can people be attacking me? I'm doing everything I can. He got up there, and I don't think he said anything. He said, well, this is the 9-month anniversary of Governor Connolly being shot in Dallas with President Kennedy. He went on and rambled for a while, thank you, and then the thing was over. So I don't know if you could do that today, but he did it. And it actually backfired on Lyndon Johnson, because by doing that, she became a bigger story than she would have been. That's typically what happens. It was all over the newspapers. And it's in these dynamic years, 62, 63, 64, 65, the dynamic years of kind of the height of the civil rights movement. And, you know, I'm sorry that Johnson did that. I wish he'd had less of an ego and been able to outreach. And it took a long time for Mississippi. I believe in 68, there was a deal that was being offered to this delegation in 64. 2 non-voting seats will give you. And I think they declined it. And 68, you begin to see some changes, and the Democratic Party moves vastly forward. One other thing I want to say about Johnson as a calculating politician, as regards Fannie Lou Hamer, from Texas, he still had dreams of keeping the South in the colony. He wanted not to lose white Southern votes, and this was costing him votes in his mind. Well, he shouldn't have bothered because Johnson and the Democrats lost the entire Confederacy anyway. He won in a landslide, but the Republicans now own the South as opposed to how it was with the Democrats. So, you know, he actually said when he was signing the 64 Act, he said, I'm losing the South for a generation. But as a politician, he was mindful that this was not going to play well with Southern whites, Fannie Lou Hamer's speech. So he just wanted to silence it in the controversy, or didn't want controversy, didn't want to be challenged. He wanted his coronation to go smoothly. Thank God for Fannie Lou Hamer, who made, it's the most memorable moment of that political year, probably. And she went on to do many other things. But I like that word, fearlessness. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
And I thought that we could have a conversation about Fannie Lou Hamer and about what this means for us today. So I welcome anything anyone wants to say, including Lynn and Greg, as we contemplate where we are 50 years later, or where we aren't.
And we're not there yet.
Yeah.
And what things like this mean, not only for our history, but as models for how we speak truth to power today. Okay, so put up. And I'd remind folks, don't feel hesitant. You can't go back and forth to the drinks and hors d'oeuvres. We've got plenty. Any thoughts on what you heard, how it strikes you, what it makes you think about in terms of where we are in 2014?
Well, I'm going to make a comment. During that time, he was giving a speech. Back in the days, my younger years, I was living in the projects, and we had a group that we did the march in Detroit and so on. And I remember, I think it was my aunt and my uncle, and we was listening to the speech. And I said, and that's when I was really getting aware of what was happening back in the days. And I said, wow, I wonder, could I ever live in the South, But, as I got older and I took, Black history classes and stuff, and I didn't really understand, because I was born in the North, but my mother, she was born in Washington, but my grandmother was down South. And she used to tell me those stories, and I'm like, well, how can people be so mean, But as I got older and, started getting more involved in it, it kind of like, made me think that we all should be one together, But that was just my experience, because I remember it, and everything. And I'm like, wow, that's my comment.
There was a lot of stuff going on television.
Yes, it was,
Presidents assassinated, Vietnam.
And I hate to sound like an old fogey, but I tell students that sometimes. I says, you can't really put yourself in the place today where people were 50 years ago. We had 3 networks. They did kind of maximum coverage of a lot of these events. And Life magazine, my family got Life magazine, and to see these these full-page black and white spreads of some of these activities, including violent activities against marchers and so forth, it was moving. And I think it was for a lot of Americans in ways that are kind of our news and the way we access the news and the way through social media, we kind of provide our individual spins on the news. It's a very, very different world. And Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement, Fannie Lou Hamer, those folks came along at the right time technologically.
And they were savvy about using television
Right.
and visual scenes.
I was always fascinated by the sharecropping part of it. My mother today is 93, doing quite well in Monroe, Louisiana. And until she was 13, she and her mother and father and her 6 siblings were sharecroppers. And it took me decades to get that out of her, because she didn't want to revisit the life that she had to live. And whenever I was around her brothers, they would always brag on her about how she could pick 100 pounds of cotton. Well, it would just send chills through my body, because I had to get this image of my mother dragging a cotton bag that will eventually total 100 pounds. And those of you who haven't ever seen cotton rolls, they are sometimes 2 miles long. And when you begin to think about that, and I think about how people came out of that. My mother is a retired licensed practical nurse. Now, how people could come out of that kind of lifestyle and still have this I am, I will, I must, I can type attitude and philosophy. I think that's one of the most amazing things about coming out of the past that many African Americans have had to live. And this is why I could never see me giving up, because that just doesn't fit in anything with which and with whom I'm associated. It just doesn't fit. And I believe that Fannie Lou Hamer had, she believed that she could make somebody do something. And I try to, and Roosevelt used that phrase, make me. And I tell folk, you want something, you got to make folk. Nobody is giving away stuff that's of value, unless there are strings attached. So Roosevelt would say, make me. Just think about that, coming out of a sharecropping background and still being able to be fearless with an I am mentality. That's a testimony that all of us can internalize and benefit from, I think.
Other comments, thoughts, Dan?
I was just, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Say thank you for allowing me to say to you personally, I certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
I remember back in '64, I was traveling to Sumner with my family. And I had a little car trouble first thing that morning, so it put me in the middle of the fact that it's all night. And I happened to be in Mississippi at the nighttime. And I was so beat out because I had been up all night the night before. And I wanted to just stop, but we didn't have decent roadside cars or anything. And it was just unheard of that we've been able to get a hotel. So I just wanted to just pull off the side of the road just to rest a little bit. But my wife pleaded with me, please don't stop in Mississippi. So I punished myself to drive all night long with no help whatsoever, because my children were so small, my wife couldn't ride, and if she could have, she'd been too afraid to keep. So she forced me to drive. I also marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. March was a march on Detroit. I marched with him. But I wouldn't feel justified with myself if I sit here and see a person who's gone through so much for us, and I wouldn't say thank you. I don't know if I could forgive myself. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. You bring to mind, we take it for granted when we kind of hit the road today and travel. In an earlier time, particularly, African Americans who traveled from north to south, it was a logistical nightmare for some of the reasons that you mentioned. I forget if the man was from Chicago or Detroit. There was an African American named Green who developed something in the 30s called the Green Book, in which he literally contacted African American communities across the nation and put together a book, and then he put out a new edition each year, letting people know, here's a gas station you could trust. Here's a family that rents out rooms. Here's a black-owned restaurant that you can get a bite to eat in. Because otherwise, people had no clue what they could depend on, where they could stop, where they could do something without risking, you know, the kind of things that drove your family's years. Just as then, white folks didn't have a clue about that logistical nightmare. I think in the midst of all the stuff that's happening, you know, from August on, and as I reminded my youngest daughter yesterday, she said, why is this all happening now? And I said, it's been happening a long time. It's just now social media is picking up on it, and we have some videos and things and so forth. Don't think that this is anything new. But, you know, a lot of whites, including people I encounter every day, simply don't have any understanding of what race impacts in the present situation. You know, polling data shows this, other things, you know, focus groups show this, that people frequently discount racism because if you're white, you don't have to deal with it. I have two sons, 30 and 28. I never had to have a discussion with them about how you have to deal, you know, encounter the police. Never had to have a discussion with them about that. Is there a single black father in America, including President Obama, who hasn't said, I have to have a discussion with my children? I don't think there is. So, you know, as we reflect on 50 years ago, I think we can also reflect on where are we now and what should we do, and how does these things provide models for us? Other conversation?
Yes. As a future historian might look back at this time, 50 years from now, would you think they would see us backsliding with voter suppression campaigns, where it's making it more difficult for people to vote, and also the fact that we are experiencing, we're finally becoming aware of the fact that young black men are targets often and treated completely differently than young white men are treated. It feels to me like we're backsliding.
Well, you know, since I teach African American history as one of the courses I teach, I reflected on that a little bit. You know, for those of us, the historians, we use the big word historiography, how people write about different parts of history at different points. And as I reflect back on an earlier moment of backsliding, in the late 19th century, you went through that wonderful list of things. If W. Du Bois, the famous African-American activist and sociologist, talks in probably his most famous book, Souls of Black Folks, has an essay called The Dawn of Freedom. And you start out, everything's very hopeful, and then everything that was promised in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment kind of disappears over the course of the late 19th century. And earlier, black activists actually used the term, revolutions sometimes do go backwards. And that happened in the late 19th century. In many ways, we're in that kind of a moment again. You know, just as the 1860s were a very hopeful moment, the 1960s were a very hopeful moment, followed by what some people refer to as, and I'm not doing this to demean particular political parties, although I will in the right venue,
It's used as a political football.
But, you know, this conservative backlash against gains by African Americans, so that they're eaten away with, and you mentioned several of them, the voter suppression laws being a great example, what's happened in the criminal justice system, so forth. So yeah, I mean, I think that people will look back probably on this time the way we today look back on the late 19th century. And that doesn't make it a very proud moment for us as Americans. Why recognize civil rights anniversaries? One is because this was an important time. But the other thing is so we don't lose track of the notion that A, we have things we need to tend to today, and B, we have people that came before that showed us how to do it. Right?
Roy, if I may add to that, can you imagine being a slave and then Emancipation Proclamation, even though some people didn't know about it until July? And notice how hopeful you would be. And then after the 14th and 15th Amendments, you would also be hopeful. And I mentioned the Enforcement Act and the Force Act that was supposed to reinforce the 15th Amendment. Well, they were repealed in 1894. So my sense, my sociological analysis of it all is that we continue to go through a cycle of backsliding. We will make 5 steps forward and then 15 steps back. And it's almost as if to say, we're going to pacify you for the moment. And then we'll move things as close to back to business as usual as we possibly can. And I just see this as a historical kind of a sequence of events. And I think today, what we're seeing now, as you pointed out, is just a continuation of that sequence, of that cycle. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I would like more people to be mindful of what's going on. As a child, I remember how happy my parents were after 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, because black people believed at that time that all we had to do was to become educated and all would be well. And then all of a sudden, the focus on quality education shifted to busing and anything else other than that. All of a sudden, you know, when we look at from 1954 to 2014, we have almost as much, if not as much, racial segregation in schools, and far more class segregation as it relates to African American than we had then. So I'm glad we have the awareness of what's going on, and I think the next question is, so what's next? And what can we do about it?
Is the arc bending toward justice?
Yes, but got to say.
Sometimes you wonder.
Yeah, I do wonder. I truly wonder.
You talked about the cycles. I was just thinking about World War I and World War II. During the war, there's all this talk about equality, citizenship, democracy, and excitement, and then disappointment at the end of each war.
You know, there are certain moments when activists on behalf of freedom and against racism have more of an opportunity to make these things happen. The post-World War II era up through the late 60s was one of those moments. Another was the 1860s. One of my favorite historical documents is a man named Robert Hamilton. Robert Hamilton was a New York City black journalist in the 1860s, and he and his brother published something called the Weekly Anglo-African, which was the closest thing to a national black newspaper in the Civil War era. And he writes an editorial right at the end of the war. And he says, you know, we have to get our full freedoms now. Not just emancipation, but citizenship, the vote, and everything else that's coming to us. Or it'll be 100 years before we have another chance to do this. Ouch. And it was. And now we're 50 years down the road and we see things slipping backwards and one wonders, is it going to be another 50 years? I hope not. I think that some of the things that are happening today maybe are bringing enough awareness that the time is right. You know, when I see people marching in the streets in a social media era where most people, you know, protest this way, I think, wow, maybe the time's right for some of this to happen again. Saw some, yes, Tim?
I actually wanted to see if we could get any comments from some of the students who are here, because in classes, when we try to do reflections on race, I get a lot of resistance from the students, and I try to talk about that and what I'm hearing. So I just want to see if any of you have any theories about this, but I'm hearing is a lot of young people feel like, well, we're beyond racism. You know, I don't treat my black friends any different than my white friends, and I don't, you know, we have a black president, and I don't see, you guys are just projecting your experience from the 60s onto now, and it's just not valid. But I don't know if that's...
Well, we got a couple of comments.
I mean, I'm not sure exactly how this relates to what you were saying directly, but like how the conversation's been molding so far. I mean, recently a man was choked down in live television. It's a video. The world saw an officer do it. A kid was shot. I haven't been in this country long enough to know all the details of everything that's happened over the past couple of years, but from as long as I had, I mean, you talk about 3 news channels covering the speech and that leading to so much. Here are multiple sources of media showing somebody dying in time and what's happened. You talk about going 5 steps forward and 15 steps back. Somebody's been killed, and I don't think we've taken a step forward, forget 5, to say something. Do you wait now till 2060 until something else happens? What happens? I mean, you were talking about how there were acts to reinforce acts and another acts. What do you do to reinforce or prevent something like this? I mean, like, somebody is dead, the person who killed this person is here, the grand jury has acquitted them. How do you go about to change something like that? I mean, according to the legal system, everything is fair and equal.
I have a sentence that I tell my students, it's my favorite sentence, and I have a word that's my favorite word. My favorite sentence is, I don't know. And my favorite word is, okay. Because okay means so many things. But let me go back to, I don't know. I don't know. Because what I can suggest or subscribe to, I'm talking about changes in the whole political structure. And so then you begin to say, well, how do you do that when you're dealing with a system that is so established? And now that we have the new rules of how you can donate millions of dollars to political campaigns, and it doesn't have to be traceable back to anybody, and it can be quite anonymous, and so now people can buy elections, and they can buy power, and corporations can pay for when they want to dump illegal chemicals somewhere and not have to deal with the laws that guide it and bind it or change the laws. So this is what we're up against. And so when we begin to talk about how do we change this, you're talking about some significant political structural changes. And I can tell you theoretically how it can be done, but I don't see it happening. We would have to, all of us below the powers that be will have to come together and would have to see ourselves as one total body that has the same kind of suffrage, just to different degrees. So until we get out of these mathematical concepts that should stay with mathematical equations such as better than and less than, until we get out of those kind of mathematical mentalities about how we view ourselves vis-a-vis other folk and other folk vis-a-vis ourselves, we're in a world of trouble. That's just the bottom line. So I don't know. And I know, but I still don't know.
Okay. Yes, sir. You have
I have a question. Is it a problem of empathy with other races? Because I write some things that, something like, on Twitter they had hashtag black and alive, and then hashtag white crimes. And then it would be things like, the one white guy who shot people in a movie theater, that case, and then he got out alive, but this one guy who was waving a toy gun got shot. I think it may be an issue of the police officers can see themselves in another white person, but if they're white and they see a black person, they immediately don't emphasize, they don't connect the same way. So I think it's not just that they're not quite, they don't understand the situation quite the same. As like if you're just white and you listen to a black conversation, you go, that was kind of weird, because you can't relate to it. So I think it's just connecting with people that's kind of the trouble. And there was something else there, there's a question in there, I can't remember what.
In Ferguson, they have a police force of 53, and they only have 3 African-American officers.
Even though the city's predominantly black.
It's a built-in problem.
There's research that's been done, and I can't name the study off the top of my head, although I have it back in my notes in my office, but where a scholar created essentially a program where he tests people in terms of how, he gives them an electronic gun that's firing at a simulation on a computer screen, and they're supposed to basically they're supposed to react, they're supposed to fire when they see someone with a gun and holster their gun when they see the person doesn't have a gun. And there are black people with guns and black people without guns that pop up at the screen, and white people with guns and white people without guns that pop up at the screen. And when he's tested this on police officers, he's tested it on ordinary citizens, white and black, and I'll focus on the whites here. In every situation, virtually everybody he's tested, the police officers and the ordinary white citizens fire much more quickly at the blacks that pop on the screen, and they're much less discriminate as to whether they have guns or not. I mean, the whites fire at black, much less discriminate. So it's something that's testable. And I think it gets back to this whole thing, you mentioned the word empathy. A lot of research going on in this term that's been coined, the racial empathy gap. The average white in all kinds of studies, and this book comes from self-reporting, and it comes from literally physiological testing of people doing how they react to certain things presented to them. An image of a black person being in a situation where they're caused pain, whether it be something stuck in their arm or whatever, provokes much less of a physiological response and a self-reported response for the average white than when they see it happening to a white person. So we've got an issue here, and I think part of it's education. A lot of it is experience. One of the things that I think gives rise to the racial empathy gap is there's a whole lot of white folks in America that just do not have experience with black folks.
Right.
Most black folks can't say that.
Right.
Most black folks have lots of experience, not always the right kind with white folks, right?
Yeah.
But most white folks don't have a lot of experience with. That's one thing that makes a place like this, I think, exciting and valuable.
Exactly. And Roy, black folk have to know white folk if we plan to succeed at any level of success we plan. It is imperative that we know white folk. But white folk don't have to know black folks. And the other thing, 2 other things, fear regarding the students' question, fear and devaluation of a human being. The concept negrophobia is alive and well beyond theory, meaning a fear of dark-skinned people of African descent. So if you fear me, you can't serve and protect me. That's the bottom line. So if I wish somebody would call me in the media so that I can give my sociological perspective on all this stuff. Because there is no way you can serve and protect me and fear me all at the same time. And there is no way
you can devalue me and serve and protect me. I have to be valued. But if you have been reared with the white supremacy mentality, you got to devalue me to stay within that equation. So these are just some of the things that we're dealing with.
And the problem to me is, how do you tell a person that their perspective is skewed if they don't understand that it's skewed? If you have people who have never been around black people or who have come in contact negatively, you can't tell them. They'll say, well, I'm not, I am good with everybody. I've had an experience where it's almost like they treat you like you're from another planet. And that is so discouraging, because of all of these years, you mean to tell me that you can't. I had somebody write on the paper, what do you mean light skin? Is he an albino? And I just can't understand how you can be in the United States, this melting pot, and not have some kind of experience with other.
Because you don't have to. It's convenient. You can put blinders on and move right along, all hunky-dory, no problem. Many people live that kind of life. It's called a comfort zone. Many people are very comfortable within their comfort zone. Years ago, I had 2 students to put on a concept of beauty for them. Very bright students, 2 white female students. And I was a little late because I had a class that conflicted with the time. So when I came in, the students said, oh, Dr. Lewis, we just formed the lines. And if you believe that white women think that you are beautiful, you get in this line. And if you think that white women think that you are unattractive, you get in this line. So I said, well, you don't have a line for me. So these are 2 very bright students and did not really look at how they had framed that thing. The way they framed it meant that there was some kind of premium on me having white folk determine my beauty. So she said, what you mean we don't have a line? I said, because whites don't determine my beauty. I determine my beauty. Why would you look at the history of black-white relations and then you're going to let the very group of people that have oppressed you determine whether you cute? So they didn't see that, and these are very intellectually bright students. And sometimes you can wake them up, and sometimes you can't.
I guess I have a question. You're talking about Ferguson and then the different ratios between the cops and then the black citizens. I guess I was in a class and I heard that Southfield has that same ratio with white cops and then black citizens. But the thing is, they actually have a relationship and they don't really have issues as serious as it is in Ferguson. How do you suggest, I know that you talked about legislation and it's just difficult to actually get anything passed and actually implement it even after it is passed. So what kind of tips would you give to building communities and building relationships with cops?
Well, first of all, I would bring back the residency law. Detroit has gone through, and I'm not putting all of this on the change in the residency law. I am putting at least 20 to 30% on. Once Detroit said police officers, firefighters, people who work for the city didn't have to live here, you began to, you saw a decline. I have stopped police officers to say, somebody's taking aluminum siding from this house. They said, well, hey, I'm not dealing with that. But if he lived there, it would make a difference. If he lived there, we wouldn't have all the copper being stolen. That's one thing. Attitudes are very difficult to change. But if we can have real significant diversity gatherings such as this, and I'm excluding myself from the significance of this, and I have to give deference to Dr. Finkenbine, who suggested this, okay? Significant gatherings such as this, they will begin to make a difference. When we go home and we begin to tell the truth a truth. We have to be truth-driven. And we can't fear the truth. I have to tell the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly of African Americans and all humanity to live with Lyn Lewis. Because I want to make sure that I at least stay truth-focused. And so that's what each individual one of us can do, regardless of how painful it is. Let's be more truthful about the situation. And let's try to encourage people to get out and register and vote and become more politically aware and politically savvy.
People are disengaged.
They're just so disengaged. It's like they have a laissez-faire type mentality. They figure that the vote won't make a difference, and it does. It really does. So things can get better. I'm not about to give up. I have one of my favorite poets is Claude McKay. And Claude McKay's most famous poem is If We Must Die. And his last line is, which I told my folk to put on my tombstone, pressed to the wall dying, but fighting back. That's what I want on my tombstone, even if they forget my name. Because I think we need to have that kind of mentality, that no matter how small a difference we are making, as long as we are making a difference, that counts.
Kind of like involving that, like what Father Tim said about students and young people. Most people, from what I've seen thus far, they've lived a sheltered life. They've come to, okay, I've come to the UDM, and now we walk around, we do our thing, and when we associate things from the experience, when they stereotype or judge a black person for being a criminal, they say, and if I say, why would you do that? I'll get the response, well, who broke into my car, who hijacked somebody, or who thing, and they're like, why in Detroit, apparently only black people do that. So now how do I tell somebody like that, well, who's got experience and who sees only black people committing crimes, or at least the vast majority of them, who's grown up a whole life without any other kind of influence and this kind of knowledge, how do you tell somebody that, well,
if it's a person who's intellectual, who likes to collect knowledge, you can give them the statistics. People talk about black on black crime. I don't know why they don't say there's white on white crime. People, and there is endogamous criminals, you know, if you please. Same group members commit the most crimes against their group members. I don't care whether they're Hispanics, whether they're Caucasians, whether they're African Americans, but black folk are the only ones that have the label black on black.
Yeah. Most of the serial killers seem to be white.
Exactly,
Well,
exactly. And that's another thing you can tell them. First of all, when you look at the percentages, your pedophiles from a percentage point of view are overwhelmingly white. Your serial killers are overwhelmingly white. Yes, your mass murderers, so that's how you can tell them. Now, I can tell you right now that you can present all the facts you want to present, and folks will still not believe you because they don't want to. Now, when someone doesn't want to believe you, you got to let them go. Spend your energy on someone who will listen, who's trying to get at truth. Don't spend your energy on someone who has blinders on and refuses to take them off. That's your wasted time. Time is precious.
Well, Lyn, and that's, for me, that's something that's a little bit frustrating because I think there are a lot of white Americans today who have the luxury, and we hear it from of thinking, you know, that racism is, that it's a post-racial society. And when you confront them with evidence and examples and statistics, that they kind of gloss over. I was accused by somebody the other day in an argument of, well, you're stuck back in the 60s, and actually I thanked them for that. Because I thought the level of analysis was a little better then. And I think because it was a harder thing, technologically and in other ways, to go off to our own corners and and ignore what was happening in the broader society. people did start to change their minds in the 60s. I got something earlier this week from someone who's involved in the effort to create a Viola Luoso Park here in Detroit. Think about being a middle-class suburban white woman, seeing what's going on the news in the 60s and saying, wow, I can't believe they're doing that to those people. I got to be involved in it as part of the solution and giving your life for it ultimately. I think the biggest question, since whites are still, even though I think there are a lot of people extremely fearful about the changing demographics, whites are still the majority.
Sure.
How do we create awareness among that white majority? Because I can't just write those people off.
Yeah, I understand exactly what you mean. You really have to get at some nuts and bolts of what brought forth this wanting to keep the blinders on. What brought forth this, if they think that they are superior. Until we break through those things and begin to let people see the whole array of folk. Now, believe this or not, particularly the whites in the audience, I spend a lot of time convincing black folk to stop generalizing about black folk in the negative. Because some black folk have become victim to the negative stereotypical portrayal of black folk. So it is not uncommon in the black community to hear some black men say, black women ain't this, and it's it with the S in front of it. And black men say, black men say black women ain't this, black women say black men ain't this. And so I break it down and I say, well, for the black men who say black women ain't this, you're talking about your mothers and your grandmothers and your daughters and your sisters and on and on. Do you want to say that? And flip it over, you're talking about your fathers and your grandfathers. And that begins to cause people to think at a different level. And then I tell them, call a person's name. If somebody abused me or misused me or mistreated me, he has a name. Why should I use this broad brush and cause everybody else to be labeled who don't even know that person? So it's a conversation, and it reminds me of my first sociology professor told me life is hard by the yard, but a cinch by the inch. We got to take it inch by inch by inch. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.